There are moments in life you think you'll cherish forever. Your wedding day, for instance. The day everything finally falls into place, and the person you love most promises to stand by your side for the rest of your lives. I thought that day would be perfect. I was wrong. The morning had started like a dream. The sun rose gently over the hills, bathing the venue in soft light. Guests arrived dressed in their finest, their laughter echoing through the air. My parents stood by me, beaming with pride, as I adjusted my tie in the mirror. My best friend, David, patted me on the back, his usual grin plastered across his face. "Big day, huh?" he said. It was a big day, bigger than anything I'd ever experienced. Emily, the love of my life, was somewhere inside, probably fussing over the tiniest details of her dress. She was always meticulous about things like that, and I loved her for it. Standing at the altar, my heart pounded in anticipation. I could see her silhouette as she began her walk down the aisle. The guests turned, their collective sighs of admiration making me smile. She looked stunning, ethereal. For a brief moment, I felt like the luckiest man alive. Then David stepped forward. At first, I thought he was fixing my boutonniere or whispering a joke to calm my nerves. But when he cleared his throat and raised a hand to stop Emily mid-step, I felt the air in the room shift. "Wait," he said, his voice firm and steady. "This wedding can't happen." I turned to him, confused. The guests murmured. Emily froze, her bouquet trembling slightly. "She belongs to me," David continued, his voice growing louder. "I love her, and she loves me." It was as though someone had plunged a dagger into my chest. I could feel my pulse in my ears, the weight of his words suffocating me. I looked at Emily, searching her face for some sign that this was a cruel joke, a misunderstanding, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped toward David, her head bowed. The murmur of the guests turned into an uproar. My mother gasped audibly, and my father took a step forward, his fists clenched. But I just stood there, rooted to the spot, my world crumbling around me. David, my best friend since childhood, the man who had been there for every major milestone in my life, had just stolen my bride at the altar. And the worst part? He was smirking, that arrogant, self-satisfied grin, as if he'd just won some twisted game. "I'm sorry, Michael," Emily finally said, her voice barely audible, "but I can't do this." She took David's arm, and together they walked out, leaving me standing alone in front of 100 stunned guests. The laughter and whispers that followed felt like daggers in my back. I don't remember much after that. I don't remember who helped me off the altar or how I ended up back at my parents' house. But I do remember David's smirk, that mocking expression as he walked away with the woman I loved. It burned itself into my memory, igniting something deep within me. Humiliation turned to anger. Anger turned to determination. That day, as I sat alone in my childhood room, I made a vow to myself. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. David might have stolen my bride, but he'd underestimated me. The smirk he wore so proudly would be wiped off his face, and when that day came, he'd regret ever crossing me. After the ceremony, or what was left of it, I locked myself in my childhood bedroom. My parents tried to talk to me, but what could they possibly say? "It's not your fault?" Of course it wasn't my fault. That didn't make it hurt any less. For the next few days, I existed in a fog. I couldn't escape the images replaying in my head. David's smirk, Emily clutching his arm, the gasps from the guests. I didn't eat much. I didn't sleep much. And when I did, I dreamed of their laughter echoing in my ears. The world didn't stop, though. People called, texted, and showed up uninvited, each one offering their 2 cents. You dodged a bullet. She wasn't worth it. David always seemed a little too close to her. None of it helped. If anything, it made me feel worse. Where were these observations before my wedding day? Before my life imploded? Then, one afternoon, I found myself scrolling through social media. Big mistake. There they were, David and Emily, smiling as if nothing had happened. Someone had taken a picture of them at a cafe, holding hands. The caption read, "Love wins." Love wins. I nearly threw my phone across the room. David wasn't just celebrating his victory, he was flaunting it. And Emily? The woman who had promised to spend the rest of her life with me just days ago? She was all smiles, looking happier than ever. It was like I never existed. I had questions, too many to count. How long had they been sneaking around behind my back? Was I just some blind fool who ignored the signs? Every time I thought about it, my mind went back to those little moments. The way David always seemed to be around when Emily and I were together. The inside jokes they shared. The lingering glances I chalked up to friendship. Had it been obvious to everyone but me? My friends tried to cheer me up. Some took me out for drinks, though every bar we went to felt like a stage where people whispered behind their glasses, "Isn't that the guy whose bride ran off with his best man?" Others sat with me in silence, unsure of what to say. Even my parents seemed lost, unsure how to comfort their grown son who had just been publicly destroyed. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. Sitting around wallowing in self-pity wasn't going to change anything. I needed answers. And not just about Emily and David's so-called love affair. I needed to know why David would betray me like this. What had I done to deserve it? But there was something else gnawing at me, something darker. Anger. The kind of anger that makes your hands shake and your chest tighten. David had taken my happiness, my dignity, my future, and he had smiled while doing it. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him win. Not like this. So, I started digging. I went through old messages, photos, and anything that might give me a clue as to when this betrayal began. It was exhausting, reliving every moment with David and Emily, trying to piece together the timeline of my own downfall. But it was also illuminating. Patterns began to emerge. Little lies, odd coincidences, and moments that didn't seem important at the time but now screamed for attention. David had planned this. Not on a whim, but carefully and deliberately. The man I had called my best friend had been scheming behind my back for months, maybe even years. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that Emily had gone along with it, or the realization that I had trusted someone so completely only to be betrayed so utterly. But one thing was clear. David wasn't going to get away with this. Not if I had anything to say about it. I wasn't content to let the questions linger unanswered. If David thought he could humiliate me and walk away unscathed, he didn't know me as well as he thought. That's when I decided to call Sophia. Sophia was a private investigator I'd worked with briefly during a business dispute. She was sharp, relentless, and, most importantly, discreet. When I told her my story, she didn't waste time on pity or moral outrage. She simply said, "Tell me everything you know, and I'll find out what you don't." That's when the real unraveling began. Sophia started with Emily. She traced her movements in the weeks leading up to the wedding, digging through receipts, social media, and phone records. The picture she painted was worse than I'd imagined. Emily hadn't just fallen into David's arms by accident. He had orchestrated the entire thing. David preyed on her insecurities, feeding her doubts about me and our future together. He planted seeds of mistrust so carefully that Emily never even realized she was being manipulated. Sophia showed me texts between them, where David spun stories about my so-called infidelity and claimed I wasn't ready for marriage. My stomach turned as I read his lies, each one crafted to drive a wedge between us. But that was just the beginning. Sophia dug deeper into David's life, uncovering a web of deception that stretched far beyond my personal betrayal. We'd been business partners for years, building our small tech startup from the ground up. I trusted him with the finances, the contracts, everything. As it turned out, that was my biggest mistake. David had been embezzling money from the company, funneling funds into a secret account under a fake name. He wasn't just stealing my bride. He was stealing my future. If Sophia hadn't found the evidence, I might have ended up bankrupt while David disappeared with Emily and my hard-earned savings. It was a calculated betrayal, designed to leave me with nothing. And he had almost succeeded. I confronted Sophia after she laid it all out for me, the anger bubbling over. Why? Why go to such lengths to destroy me? What does he gain from all this? She shrugged, her expression calm but sympathetic. Some people don't need a reason. They just like to win. And David? He's been winning at your expense for a long time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with David. Every time I defended him, covered for his mistakes, or celebrated his achievements. It had all been one-sided. He'd never been my friend. He'd been a parasite, feeding off my trust and loyalty. I thought about Emily, too. She wasn't innocent in all this, but now I understood how David had twisted her mind. She was a pawn in his game, just like I had been. It didn't absolve her of blame, but it did change the way I saw her. By morning, my mind was clear. David had taken so much from me. My love, my pride, my livelihood. But he hadn't taken everything. I still had my will, my intelligence, and now, thanks to Sophia, I had the truth. It wasn't enough to expose him privately. David had humiliated me in front of everyone I cared about. If I wanted justice, it had to be just as public, just as devastating. The plan began to form in my mind, piece by piece. I didn't care how long it took or what it cost me. David had stolen my life, and I was going to take it back. The best part? He'd never see it coming. Confronting David wasn't something I rushed into. It took weeks of mental preparation, though it wasn't patience that slowed me down. It was strategy. I needed to approach him at the right moment, when his guard was down and his ego was inflated, so he wouldn't suspect a thing. David was smug, but he wasn't stupid. He had been careful to cover his tracks, confident that his lies and manipulations would keep him untouchable. What he didn't know was that I now held all the cards. The opportunity presented itself one evening when I heard through a mutual friend that David had moved into a high-end apartment downtown. Of course, he didn't buy it under his name. Sophia had uncovered the shell company he used to make the purchase, paid for, no doubt, with the money he'd stolen from our business. Still, David wasn't one to keep a low profile. The new address screamed wealth and success, the kind he didn't deserve. I showed up unannounced. No texts, no calls. Just me, standing at his door with a calm smile, masking the rage simmering beneath. When he opened the door, his expression shifted from surprise to satisfaction. He thought I was there to grovel, to beg for answers, or some pathetic attempt at reconciliation. "Well, this is a surprise," David said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Didn't think you'd ever want to see me again." "I didn't," I replied evenly, "but I think it's time we talked." He invited me in, playing the gracious host, offering drinks and acting as if the wedding fiasco had been a minor inconvenience. His arrogance was staggering. He didn't even flinch when I mentioned Emily. "She's fine," he said with a shrug, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "Still adjusting, you know? These things take time." "These things?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Like stealing someone's fiancé?" David chuckled, swirling the liquid in his glass. "Come on, Michael. Don't be so dramatic. You and Emily were never going to last." I just sped up the inevitable. I clenched my fists but forced myself to stay calm. Anger wouldn't win this battle. Strategy would. I leaned back, feigning indifference, and said, "You're probably right. She wasn't who I thought she was. And honestly, neither were you." That got his attention. His smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I know," I said, locking eyes with him. "About everything. The money, the lies, the fake accounts. All of it." For the first time, David looked genuinely uneasy. He set his glass down, his movements slower, more deliberate. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. "Don't insult me, David," I said, leaning forward. "You've been siphoning money from our company for years, setting me up to take the fall if anyone found out. You didn't just betray me, you tried to ruin me. And for what? To boost your own ego? To prove you could take what was mine?" He didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened, and his hands fidgeted slightly, a crack in his polished exterior. Finally, he laughed, though it sounded forced. "You don't have proof," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Oh, but I do," I said, pulling out my phone. I played a short recording, Sophia's favorite piece of evidence, a conversation between David and one of his shady financial partners. It was just enough to hint at his guilt without giving away the full extent of what I had. David's face paled. "You've been spying on me?" he hissed. "Spying? No, I said. Uncovering the truth? Absolutely. And here's the thing. I'm not here to warn you or give you a chance to explain yourself. I'm here to let you know that your time is up. He laughed again, this time louder, as if he were trying to convince himself that he still had the upper hand. What are you going to do, Michael? Run to the police? They won't believe you. You don't have enough to take me down. Not yet, I admitted, standing to leave. But soon. I left him there, seething and unsure of how much I really knew. The confrontation wasn't about ending things. It was about planting the seed of doubt in his mind, making him squirm. And it worked. Over the next few days, Sophia monitored his movements. He made several frantic calls, shuffled money between accounts, and even reached out to Emily, likely trying to ensure her loyalty. Meanwhile, I refined the plan. I didn't just want David exposed. I wanted him humiliated. He had made a spectacle of my pain, and I intended to return the favor. With Sophia's help, I began setting the trap, carefully orchestrating the moment when his empire of lies would come crashing down. David thought he was invincible. That was his first mistake. His second? Underestimating me. It's funny how people can convince themselves they're happy when they're standing knee-deep in a pile of lies. That's where Emily found herself, caught in David's web of charm and manipulation, believing she'd made the right choice. I didn't expect her to realize the truth. Not anytime soon, at least. But the thing about David is, he always overplays his hand. And when he did, Emily finally saw him for who he really was. I didn't hear from her directly at first. In fact, I wasn't even sure she would reach out to me again, not after the stunt she pulled at the altar. But Sophia had been keeping tabs on both of them, and what she uncovered was almost satisfying enough to make me forget the pain. David wasn't exactly the Prince Charming Emily had imagined. At first, things seemed picture-perfect. Fancy dinners, expensive gifts, whispered promises of a future together. But underneath it all, David's true nature started to bleed through. He was controlling, jealous, and quick to anger when things didn't go his way. Sophia told me about an incident where Emily had asked a harmless question about their finances. David exploded, accusing her of not trusting him. He stormed out, leaving her in tears. It wasn't the kind of behavior she had signed up for, but by then, she was in too deep to back out easily. The real turning point came when Emily stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see. A folder of documents David had carelessly left out in their apartment. It was filled with details about the money he'd stolen, the fake accounts, and, worst of all, his plans to pin the blame on me if things ever went south. That's when it hit her. She hadn't traded up by leaving me for David. She'd been used. When she finally called me, I didn't recognize her voice at first. It was trembling, thick with guilt, and something that almost sounded like desperation. "Michael," she said, hesitating, "I need to talk to you." I'll admit, I wasn't eager to hear her out. Part of me wanted to hang up and let her deal with the mess she'd created. But curiosity got the better of me. "I'm listening," I said, my tone colder than I intended. "I was wrong," she began, her words rushing out like she'd been holding them back for weeks. "About everything. About you. About David. He's not who I thought he was." "Funny how that works," I replied dryly. "What changed your mind? Did he run out of money to throw at you?" She flinched at my sarcasm, but I didn't care. She deserved worse. Still, she pushed on. "I found something," she said. "Documents. Proof of what he's been doing. Michael, he's been lying to me, just like he lied to you." The bitterness in her voice was almost satisfying. Almost. "And now you want my help?" I asked, incredulous. "After everything?" "No," she said quickly. "I don't expect you to help me. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what I did to you. For believing him." Her apology hung in the air, heavy with unspoken regret. Part of me wanted to accept it, to let the pain go and move on. But another part of me, stronger, angrier, couldn't let her off the hook so easily. "Sorry doesn't change anything, Emily," I said finally. "You chose him. You stood there and let him humiliate me in front of everyone I know. And now, what? You want redemption because you realized he's a liar? Welcome to the club." She didn't argue. She just let out a shaky breath and said, I deserve that. I know I do. But Michael, I want to help you. I want to make this right. That caught me off guard. Help me how? I'll testify, she said. If you're planning to go after him, and I know you are, I'll back you up. I'll give you the documents, whatever you need. I just want to fix what I broke. I didn't answer right away. Trusting Emily again wasn't something I could do easily, but her offer was tempting. With her help, I could bring David down even faster. Still, I wasn't ready to forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Send me the documents, I said finally. We'll go from there. She agreed, and we hung up. As I stared at my phone, a strange mix of emotions churned inside me. Part of me felt vindicated. She'd finally seen David for the fraud he was. But another part of me felt hollow. Her apology didn't erase the betrayal. It didn't undo the damage. Sophia, ever the realist, summed it up best when I told her what happened. She's useful, but don't let your guard down, she warned. People like her always have an agenda. Maybe she was right. Maybe Emily's guilt was just another layer of manipulation. But at that moment, I didn't care. All I cared about was making sure David paid for what he'd done. Emily might have been his pawn, but now, she was mine. The pieces were falling into place. With Emily's unexpected cooperation, I had access to the documents she'd found, evidence of David's embezzlement, fake accounts, and plans to frame me. Sophia meticulously verified everything, cross-referencing dates and transactions to ensure every shred of evidence would hold up under scrutiny. The more we uncovered, the more obvious it became. David had built his entire life on lies, and he was reckless enough to think he could get away with it. But I wasn't satisfied with just exposing him. I wanted David humiliated, his mask ripped away in front of everyone who had ever admired him. The same way he'd left me standing at the altar, humiliated in front of a crowd. I wanted his downfall to be public and undeniable. The first step was finding the perfect stage. That opportunity came in the form of David's own ego. He was throwing a farewell party, one last, extravagant celebration before he and Emily were supposed to leave the country. Sophia overheard him bragging to a mutual acquaintance about his big plans and the life-changing deal that would make him untouchable. The party was perfect. A crowd of his closest friends, business associates, and admirers all gathered in one place. They would be the audience for the grand finale. Are you sure about this? Sophia asked as we went over the plan for the 100th time. It's risky, Michael. If anything goes wrong, he could slip away. He won't, I said, my confidence unshaken. David's biggest weakness is his arrogance. He thinks he's untouchable. He won't see it coming. The plan was deceptively simple. I would attend the party, blending into the crowd just long enough to make my presence known. Meanwhile, Sophia would work behind the scenes, handing over our evidence to the authorities. Once the police had everything they needed, they would show up to make the arrest. The key was timing. David had to feel secure, in control, before we pulled the rug out from under him. Emily's role was crucial, though I didn't trust her completely. She agreed to act as bait, using her proximity to David to draw out his confidence. She played her part well, feeding him compliments and stoking his ego as he reveled in the attention of his guests. On the night of the party, I walked into the venue with a calm I didn't entirely feel. The room was a study in opulence. Champagne glasses clinking, laughter echoing off crystal chandeliers, everyone dressed to impress. And there, in the center of it all, was David. He was in his element, shaking hands, laughing loudly, and basking in the admiration of his guests. When he saw me, his smile faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. Michael, he said, feigning surprise. Didn't expect to see you here. Couldn't miss the big send-off, I replied, my tone light but loaded with meaning. David chuckled, though there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Well, enjoy yourself. It's going to be a night to remember. He wasn't wrong about that. As the evening wore on, I stayed in the background, watching and waiting. Emily played her part perfectly, keeping David occupied while Sophia and I ensured everything was in place. The authorities were stationed nearby, ready to act the moment we gave the signal. Finally, it was time. Emily led David into a quiet corner, where he couldn't resist bragging about his success. Sophia had planted a recording device nearby, capturing every word as he admitted to his schemes, laughing about how easy it had been to manipulate me and steal from the company. His arrogance was staggering. "That idiot never saw it coming," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Michael's too soft, too trusting. I almost feel bad for him. Almost." That was the last thing he said before the police arrived. The room fell silent as officers entered, their presence cutting through the laughter and chatter like a blade. David's confusion quickly turned to panic as they approached him, a warrant in hand. "David Carter, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The color drained from his face. "What? This has to be some kind of mistake," he sputtered, his confidence crumbling as the crowd stared in shock. I stepped forward then, locking eyes with him. "No mistake, David. You're finally getting what you deserve." His smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure desperation. As the officers cuffed him and led him out, the room erupted in whispers and gasps. David Carter, the golden boy, the charmer, the so-called success story, was exposed as a fraud in front of everyone who had ever admired him. The satisfaction I felt in that moment was immeasurable. David had taken everything from me, but now? Now he was the one left humiliated and powerless. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The scene was set, and everything was in motion. I stood near the edge of the crowd at David's farewell party, watching the man who had stolen so much from me bask in the glow of his perceived invincibility. He strutted around the room, shaking hands and clinking glasses, his charm cranked up to full volume. He looked untouchable, confident in his lies, and smug in his betrayal. But I knew better. His reign was about to come crashing down, and this room full of admirers would bear witness to his fall. I kept my distance, sipping a drink I didn't taste, biding my time. Sophia was stationed outside with the authorities, ready to swoop in at the perfect moment. Emily, to her credit, was playing her role like a seasoned actor, keeping David distracted while subtly leading him to the trap we'd set. It didn't take long for David's ego to get the better of him. In a private corner of the room, with Emily hanging on his every word, he began to boast. It was the kind of boasting that only someone like David could do. Confident, arrogant, and dripping with disdain for everyone he thought was beneath him. "They'll never catch me," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the hidden recorder Sophia had planted to catch every word. Michael was too easy to fool. He never even questioned me. And the money? Let's just say it's sitting in places he'll never find. Emily played along, her laugh soft and encouraging. "What about the business?" she asked, her tone laced with curiosity. "You're really leaving it all behind?" David smirked, leaning back with the smugness of a man who believed he'd won. "The business is a sinking ship without me. I've already drained what I needed. By the time anyone figures it out, I'll be halfway across the world, and Michael will be left holding the bag." It was all we needed. With a subtle nod from Sophia, the authorities entered the building. The air in the room shifted instantly, laughter and conversation fading into stunned silence as the officers made their way through the crowd. David didn't notice at first, too busy reveling in his perceived victory, but the sudden quiet caught his attention. He turned, his brow furrowing in confusion as the lead officer approached him. "David Carter," the officer said, his voice firm and unyielding. "You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The color drained from David's face. "What?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," I said, stepping forward from the shadows. I locked eyes with him, and for the first time in our long history, he looked truly afraid. "The only mistake was thinking you could get away with it." David's shock quickly morphed into desperation. He tried to laugh it off, turning to the guests. "This is ridiculous. A misunderstanding." But no one came to his defense. His so-called friends and admirers stared in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. The officers moved quickly, cuffing him and reciting his rights as murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I'll fix this," David said, his voice rising in panic. "Michael, come on. We can talk about this." I crossed my arms, letting him squirm. "You didn't want to talk when you stole from me, lied to me, and humiliated me. Why would I listen now? His smirk, the one that had haunted me for weeks, was gone. In its place was a look of pure desperation. He begged, pleaded, even tried to implicate others in his schemes, but it was no use. The evidence was airtight, and there was no escape. As the officers led him toward the exit, the whispers in the crowd grew louder. People who once sang his praises were now condemning him, their admiration replaced by outrage and disgust. It was poetic, really, David, who thrived on attention and approval, being publicly shamed and abandoned by the very people he'd sought to impress. Emily stood frozen, watching the man she'd once left me for dragged away in handcuffs. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. I didn't offer her any solace. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. When the doors closed behind David, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The humiliation he'd inflicted on me had been returned tenfold. The man who once stood at my side, smirking at my pain, had been exposed for the fraud he was. And this time, I was the one standing tall. The guests slowly began to disperse, their voices low and uncertain as they processed what had just happened. I didn't stay long. There was no need. I'd accomplished what I came to do, and David's fall from grace was complete. As I stepped outside, Sophia met me with a satisfied smile. "That went well," she said. I nodded, letting out a long breath. Better than I imagined. The fallout from David's arrest was monumental. It wasn't just his friends and colleagues who turned their backs on him. The media picked up the story, turning him into a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. Everywhere I went, people whispered about the man who stole his best friend's bride and got exactly what he deserved. For the first time in weeks, the whispers weren't about me, they were about him. And yet, I felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure. Emily, on the other hand, wasn't faring much better. The scandal had left her ostracized from the very social circles she'd once craved. David's lies had entangled her too deeply, and though she wasn't guilty of his crimes, she bore the weight of her choices. She reached out to me again, this time in person. I wasn't sure what to expect when I opened the door to find her standing there, her face pale and her eyes hollow. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," she began, her voice trembling. I need to explain." I let her in, more out of curiosity than compassion. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands clasped tightly, and began to speak. She told me how David had slowly, methodically, turned her against me, how he'd planted doubts, exploited her insecurities, and painted himself as the only one who truly understood her. She admitted she'd been naive, blinded by his charm and the excitement of something new. "I believed him when he said you didn't love me," she said, her voice breaking. "But now I see. He was the one who didn't care about anyone but himself." Her words were heavy with regret, but they didn't erase the pain she'd caused. Still, I could see she was genuinely remorseful. She had been as much a victim of David's manipulation as I had been, and while that didn't absolve her, it made her betrayal easier to understand. "I'll testify against him," she said, her gaze steady. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he pays for what he's done. Not just to you, but to me, too." I nodded, appreciating her resolve, but keeping my distance emotionally. "Thank you," I said simply, "but don't do it for me. Do it for yourself." As the weeks passed, Emily kept her word. Her testimony was crucial in solidifying the case against David, and her willingness to come clean helped expose even more of his schemes. She didn't ask for anything in return. No reconciliation, no second chances. She seemed determined to rebuild her life, brick by brick, without dragging me back into it. As for me, I focused on my own rebuilding. The company David had tried to destroy was in shambles, but with Sophia's help, I began the long process of salvaging what I could. It wasn't easy, but it was mine, and I was determined to make it stronger than ever. Through it all, Sophia became an unexpected pillar of support. She was blunt, practical, and unflinchingly honest. Everything I needed to keep me grounded. What started as a professional relationship slowly shifted into something deeper. She didn't pity me or treat me like a victim. Instead, she reminded me of my strength and pushed me to reclaim the life I'd nearly lost. One evening, as we sat going over paperwork, she looked up and said, "You know, you've come a long way from the guy who couldn't even say David's name without flinching." I smiled, realizing she was right. "I guess I have," I said, and for the first time, I felt like I could truly move on. David's trial was a spectacle, the kind you only see in movies. He tried every trick in the book to avoid accountability, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emily's testimony, combined with the documents Sophia and I had collected, sealed his fate. When the verdict came down, guilty on all counts, there was no smirk, no bravado, just a broken man being led away in handcuffs. The moment was bittersweet. I didn't feel the rush of vindication I'd expected, only a quiet sense of justice. David was out of my life for good, and the chapter of betrayal and pain he'd written was finally closed. In the months that followed, I found myself letting go of the anger and hurt I'd carried for so long. I began to focus on the future, rebuilding not just my business but also my sense of self. Sophia stayed by my side, her presence steady and unwavering, and what started as friendship slowly blossomed into something more. One evening, as we walked through the park, she turned to me and asked, "Do you regret any of it? The wedding, the business, even David?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "No," I said, "because without all of that, I wouldn't be here now. And here? Feels pretty good." The story didn't end with a grand declaration of triumph or a dramatic twist. It ended quietly, with me reclaiming my life, piece by piece, and realizing that even the deepest wounds can heal with time, effort, and the right people by your side. David had tried to destroy me, but in the end, he only destroyed himself. And as I stood on the edge of my new beginning, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't defined by his betrayal. I was defined by how I rose above it. David's trial became the talk of the town. It wasn't just about the crimes he committed, embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, but the betrayal, the personal and public humiliation he had caused. His name, once synonymous with charm and success, now became a cautionary tale. People who had once admired him openly denounced him, distancing themselves as if his downfall might tarnish their own reputations. It was a stark reminder of how quickly admiration turns to disdain when masks slip. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters clamoring for details and spectators eager to witness the fall of someone who had climbed so high. I sat in the back, quiet and composed, watching as the man who had once been my best friend squirmed under the weight of undeniable evidence. Emily's testimony was damning, her voice steady as she recounted how he had manipulated her and betrayed me. Sophia's meticulous work ensured every financial misdeed was laid bare, each document and transaction painting a picture of his deceit. David tried to fight back, of course. He claimed innocence, accused others of framing him, and even attempted to spin himself as a victim of circumstance. But the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was overwhelming, the lies too blatant to ignore. His defense crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. When the guilty verdict was read, there was no dramatic outburst, no pleas for mercy. David simply sat there, staring at the table in front of him, as if the reality of his situation had finally sunk in. The man who had laughed as he stole my bride and my business was now a shadow of his former self, silent, defeated, and utterly alone. In the weeks that followed, the media moved on to the next scandal, and the world slowly forgot about David Carter. But for me, his downfall wasn't just a spectacle, it was a lesson. I realized that his betrayal, while painful, had been a catalyst for change. It forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities, to rebuild not just my business but my sense of self-worth. Emily, for her part, disappeared from public view. She sent me a letter after the trial, thanking me for giving her the chance to make things right. She said she was moving to a smaller town to start over, to find out who she was without David's influence or the shadow of her past mistakes. I wished her well, though I didn't respond. Some chapters are better left closed. Sophia remained a constant presence in my life, her sharp wit and unwavering support helping me navigate the aftermath. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, she turned to me and said, "You know, you could have let this break you. Most people would have, but you didn't." I didn't have much of a choice, I replied, smiling softly. It was either rise above it or let him win. And you rose, she said, her tone filled with quiet admiration. Not everyone can do that. Her words stayed with me. It wasn't just about winning or proving a point anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, about refusing to let someone else's betrayal define me. I had lost so much, my trust, my pride, my future as I had envisioned it. But in losing those things, I gained something far more valuable: resilience. David's story ended in a prison cell, stripped of the power and respect he had so carefully crafted. Mine, however, was just beginning. I rebuilt my business, this time on my own terms, surrounding myself with people I could trust. I found new friendships, new opportunities, and even the beginnings of new love. Sophia and I grew closer, her honesty and strength a grounding force in my life. Looking back, I realized that David's betrayal, as devastating as it was, had set me free. It had forced me to let go of the illusion of control, to see people for who they truly were, and to find strength within myself. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But I learned that even the deepest wounds heal with time, effort, and the right people by your side. David had tried to destroy me, but in the end, he only destroyed himself. And as I stood on the threshold of a new chapter, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the man who had been humiliated at the altar anymore. I was the man who had risen above it. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.